We have a lot of things planned over the next month, so I'm going to bring our youth services librarian up here, Hannah Farmer, because I want her to talk about some of the things we have planned for the children and teens and preteens.
Thank you, Jackie. Yes, I just want to take a minute to plug the programs we're doing as part of the Seguin Talks About Race. Next week, our toddler time and story time are themed Celebrating Differences is our theme. We'll be outside. It's the first time we've done in-person story times since the beginning of the pandemic. So we're excited to do that, and we'll be featuring books that celebrate differences, whether that is depicting people of color and also lifting up authors of color. So we're really excited about that. We'll also be putting up a story walk outside, which is a thing a lot of libraries are doing that is a story time while you're walking. And so there will be stations with the storybook pages laminated on the signs around the trail outside the library. And then for preteens and teens, we're very excited to be doing a art and writing contest. The contest will be divided into the preteen age group and teen age group, and there will be an art portion or a writing portion, or they can do both. And there's more information on these flyers that we have at the front over there in the works. But I did want to share the prompt with you because I think it's really a beautiful quote that we start with. This is a quote from Rudine Sims Bishop, Professor Emeritus at The Ohio State University. And she says, "Books are sometimes windows, offering views of worlds that may be real or imagined, familiar or strange. These windows are also sliding glass doors, and readers have only to walk through in imagination to become part of whatever world has been created or recreated by the author. When lighting conditions are just right, however, a window can also be a mirror, reflecting, Literature transforms human experience and reflects it back to us. And in that reflection, we can see our own lives and experiences as part of a larger human experience." And that's the end of the quote. So we challenge teens to write 250 to 500 words about a book, comic book, movie, or TV show that has been a window into another culture or group, and compare that to a book or comic that mirrors their own lives. We ask them, what is it like, or what do you think it would be like when you can't find a book or comic that represents you? And so we're challenging them to think about representation in media and pop culture. We talk a lot about comics with the teens that come into the library already, so we also have as a prize, Freddie Lopez Jr. is a Hispanic comic book artist that works with Marvel, and he's from San Antonio. He has agreed to draw prizes for the winners of the contests. And especially for the art contest, we challenged preteens and teens to create a character that they would like to see represented in comics. And so he will do a professional rendering of that character. And then the winning art and writing will also be published in the KWED Daily News website. If you have any questions, you can come ask me at the end of the program. I have the prompts for all the contests over by the bench. Thank you. Yes. Okay.
Thank you, Hannah. Also, we are having 2 book discussions that are going to focus mainly on the books that you want to talk about race. And then lastly, we want to encourage you and the people you know, and encourage the people you know to come and make an appointment and tell us your story. Because we want to record those and then make those available to the public so everyone can hear the different stories. I know when I started this with Darren and the staff here at the library started telling their story. So everybody has a story to tell, and I encourage you to do that. I'm going to turn this over to Darren Gunn, who is one of our moderators. Darren, for those of you who don't know, is the director of KWED and part owner, and also man about town. Here's Darren.
Thank you, Jackie. I appreciate that a great deal. I just want to say thank you to everyone for being here today. I think this is a very important moment for us all to come together as a community and to begin to have this very important discussion. And like so many of you, my heart has been heavy, my mind has been full of all of these ideas and emotions and feelings that I didn't know what to do with them, but I felt like we had to find a way to make it, those feelings, those emotions, those experiences productive for our community and beyond. And before I say anything else, I just want to say thank you so much to the Seguin Public Library for really jumping in and taking what was just a simple idea and making it something special. And I would be remiss if I did not recognize some of the partners who just stepped up and said, yeah, we'll support however we can. They didn't make any real commitment right away because we didn't have anything for them to commit to, but they all said they were fully in, and the decision makers in those organizations were just terrific all throughout this process. So I want to thank Texas Lutheran University, the Seguin ISD, and the Navarro ISD. They were all very, very willing to be part of this from the beginning. And thank you to those in the faith community who have also stepped forward to be part of this today. Anytime I'm full of emotion, I try to write my thoughts down, and sometimes I do that with poetry, and I will readily admit it's not always good. But I did that today because I just felt like this was so important, and we had so much to say, and we've got this great panel who you're going to get to meet. So I just want to read this poem real quick, and then I'll introduce our moderator for today and let it get this underway. We are here. We are here because now is the time. We have to be better. We are doing this because who else will? We absolutely can move this world in a better direction. We are beginning something. We are beginning something because all the talk, the study, the work has no finish line. The path is not smooth, but together we will get by. We are here. We are Seguin. We are Americans. We are one. We come in many shades. We love who we love. We stand up for what's right. We are here to all be better. We are here to talk about race. I hope that expression helps to sort of encapsulate some of the feelings that I think everyone in this room and everyone who's watching now has had, especially through this crazy 2020 times when we've been in a pandemic and we've been forced to confront that because all of those things that we use to ignore it and to escape from it were taken away from us. And that's why this is the time. I want to introduce our moderator, Reverend Jeremy Roy. Jeremy is the Director of Pastoral Care at Resolute Health Hospital in New Braunfels. He is also a member of the Seguin City Council. More importantly, I call Jeremy my friend, and he's just a really great guy and a great voice to have as part of this discussion. So Jeremy, I'm going to turn things over to you.
Thank you, Darren. I just want to say as we start that I am extremely proud of my hometown. We have not been afraid to enter into this conversation. Darren said, Seguin Independent School District, TLU, the Barrow Independent School District, the City of Seguin, our police department, our police chief has been meeting with a coalition since the week of George Floyd's death, meeting with leaders in the black community in Seguin to try to understand the issue of race. And then this conversation, this panel, we could have very easily, as a little community, said, oh wait, this doesn't touch us. But guess what? We, without fear, have moved into this conversation in a very intentional way. And I just want to say, I'm proud of us. And I'm proud of you. Proud of you for being here and proud of those that are watching. I wanted to cover just a couple of suggestions as we have this discussion. I think the first suggestion or reminder would be that it is a discussion, not a debate. Right? We're not here to challenge each other than telling our own stories, which are often, that often challenges other people, right? As we hear about one another's struggles, as we hear about the things that we've experienced, that can often be challenging, but it's not a debate, it is a discussion. And I thought these four thoughts could help us as we visit together. That we would speak from the heart, and that we would listen from the heart, and that we would be spontaneous. In other words, as the other person is speaking, let's not mentally prepare and rehearse what we're going to say. Let's try to be spontaneous. Let it come from the heart. Listen from the heart. And this last thing is challenging, especially for those of us that are Baptists and used to the pulpit. That includes me. Be lean of expression. Be lean of expression. Get to the heart of it immediately. And feel free to just end it where it needs to be ended. So, brethren, which obviously is a challenge for yours truly. So, let's get started. If assumption is truly the enemy of knowing, if assumption is truly the enemy of knowledge, we don't want to assume anything about any one of the people on our panel. I'm going to first read their bio, so you'll know a little bit about them, but then I'm going to ask you a very specific question. So to my very far right is Dr. Bernadette Buchanan. She is currently the Associate Dean of Student Life and Learning, Experiential Learning, and Career Development at Texas Lutheran University. She received her PhD in Higher Education at Washington State University, and under her direct leadership is the Center for Servant Leadership, Career Development Services, Campus Ministry, and is the PI for the Department of Justice Office on Violence Against the Women Campus Grant, and serves as a Senior Deputy Title IX Coordinator. In addition to her commitment to students in higher education, Dr. Buchanan enjoys time with her young family. Seated next to her is Reverend Elliott. Megan is a proud member of the LGBTQ community, and she is head pastor at the local Spirit of Joy Lutheran Church. She earned a bachelor's degree in social work from Malone University and received her Master of Divinity degree from Trinity Lutheran Seminary in Ohio. As shown by her diverse church congregation, she strives to unify the citizens of Seguin, regardless of their sexual orientation, gender identity, or cultural ethnic backgrounds. The Reverend Jimmy Flakes is head pastor at Second Baptist Church in Seguin, Texas. He received a bachelor's degree at St. Mary's University in San Antonio, Texas. In 2000, he was a neighborhood coordinator for the city of Austin, where he facilitated neighborhood focus group meetings to develop improved neighborhood quality of life solutions. Pastor Flakes provides spiritual and religious educational leadership by mentoring citizens through local outreach. Mr. Jacinto Ramos Jr. is currently serving as the Chief of Board Governance and Leadership at Leadership ISD in Fort Worth. He is chair of the 2019-2020 Council of Urban Boards of Education, the next president of the Mexican American School Boards Association, and board of directors of the Texas Association of School Boards. He is also the school board president of the Fort Worth Independent School District. He was raised by his immigrant parents from Mexico, devoting countless hours providing a voice to the disengaged and the disenchanted youths of today. He's nationally recognized for his role in activism, leadership, and community engagement. And then here on this end is Rashad Tolbert. He is a senior at Texas Lutheran University. He's double majoring in business management and marketing. He is the comptroller for the Student Government Association and the president of the Black Student Union for the past 2 years. As president of BSU, he strives to not only empower but inform others about both the past and present with the hope they can better the future. Out of his many accomplishments as student leader, he prides himself most with building a bridge between the Black alumni and his peers at TLU. So let's give our panelists a So in the spirit of not assuming anything about any of you, I want to ask you this question. Because we could look up here and make some assumptions just by looking at you. But here's what I want to know. How do you identify racially, ethnically, culturally? And you don't have to hit all three of those, but tell us who you are in the context of race, ethnicity, and culture. And let's start at the other end with Dr. Buchanan.
Thank you for allowing me to be here today. I identify as a cisgender female, African American, Pentecostal, middle child, and daughter of a military retired Air Force veteran. I'm assuming we're just going down the line.
Let's do that.
Okay. I am Elliott, and I am white and Midwestern and Lutheran and a cisgender queer woman. And let's see that's our identity.
Jimmy Place. Black, Negro, African American, colored, and all of those things I've been through, I've been called across the years. I'm just me, and I'm from the country. But I pastored church, Second Baptist Church, my second time at this church. This is my last church, I think.
They can hear it there.
African American.
Not done.
Good afternoon. So culturally, I subscribe to the culture of fathers, partner, husband to Anita for 22 years, Roman Catholic, culturally from the north side, funky town of Fort Worth, Texas, and ethnically, first generational Mexican American, Mexican descent, father from Acuña, Coahuila, mom from Morelia, Michoacán, and even further layer, which is the one that's at the heart of my history from a point of liberation, is of the Purupacha indigenous people in the mountains.
My name is Rashad. Sorry. I'm an African American male. I'm only 21, so I'm still trying to figure out some things. But yeah, I'm a country boy. Yeah, that's about it.
So the second question follows that one. What aspect of your racial or ethnic identity makes you the proudest? And Rashad, let's start with you.
I think what makes me the proudest, if I'm answering your question correctly, is just the resiliency that my family or my community that we have. I think that makes me the proudest.
Very good, very good. Cinta?
Yeah, so for me, I think you may have noticed how I worked my way down the ethnic identity. And then when I got to the last one, that was my greatest source of pride. And I also noted that I know my history from a point of liberation, which was pre-colonial times. So to say that I'm of Mexican descent also has a whole history associated and attached to that. So not to demean that and say that that's not a part of me, I acknowledge that it is. It is to say that to know the indigenous bloodline that I come from, that I can speak and stand in front of anyone and say my name is Jacinto Ramos Jr. and not have to mispronounce that. It comes from that root. And I'll begin by saying that my greatest mentors taught me that you can't love the fruit if you don't love the root. And so I had noticed and acknowledged early on that the educational system was not giving me my history. So I couldn't speak to that. And once I tapped into that, and I had to wait till I got to higher ed, and was blessed and privileged to have encountered some amazing professors, they jolted me into consciousness. And so when I say of the Purupecha indigenous people, we are fishermen and women, we are community driven, we are tribal in all the best aspects. And then most importantly, and I'll share with you later, I come from our people that are great negotiators. So when I ran for office, that plant had already I already had that seed planted.
Jimmy?
Do your question again.
Yeah, so in regards to your racial and ethnic identity, what are you the most proud of? What makes you proud to be a black man, black pastor?
Okay. What I'm most proud of is my heritage. I come from a huge family on my mother's side. It was 17 of them. And I have more cousins than the size of Seguin. I got a huge number of cousins. But I'm proud of the diversity in that family. We have that part of my family. We have all kinds of marriages, all kinds of relationships. We have all kinds of people. And one of my mother's first cousins, who grew up with me, told me one time when I made a crack at a funeral in the bathroom because they didn't know his name. And I said, you know, your cousins can't even remember what your name is. And he said to me, I love every one of them. And that's what I'm most proud about, is all of the diversity in my family and the love that I have for every one of them.
Beautiful. Thanks, Jimmy. Thank you.
This is a complicated question to answer as somebody who's sitting here, the only white person on this panel. And I'm very proud to be a queer woman, especially living in a small city in Texas. But also, I think, you know, my whiteness is descended from German, Swedish, and Scotch-Irish. But I will say that most of those cultural identifiers in my own family and my own history have been swallowed up by this concept of whiteness and white supremacy. So for me to claim any sort of pride around racial or ethnic identity makes me deeply uncomfortable. And I think that's really all I can say about that.
I think I can identify with that personally. I was walking over here and one of my neighbors said, "Where are you going?" And I thought, here I go, you know, this 50-year-old overweight, white Baptist pastor, you know, coming to moderate a conversation on race. And since Darren asked me to do it, the minute he asked me to do it, I began to wonder, where do I fit in that conversation? But then, at his request, was willing, just like you've done, step into it, embrace it, and be gracious. You're tremendously gracious. Dr. Buchanan.
For me, what I'm most proudest of about being Black or African American is everything. I just love it. I love being Black. I don't know if you guys remember that little girl. It was a YouTube thing. She's like, I like my hair. I like my house. I like my car. I like this. It's like, I just love being Black. And even in the darkest of times, like George Floyd that you have mentioned, I can say, even after I saw that, the quote that sticks out to me most is, and still I rise. It's like, no matter what happens to us, and still I rise. So, I just like being Black. But to the comment of being white, like, I want to encourage you to, it's okay to be white. And it's okay to accept your whiteness and accept the fact that no matter what happened to people of color culturally, there were always people, especially in the religious communities, who were fighting back. And I always think about Harriet Tubman and her work getting from the South to Canada, 16 times by foot? If there were not white people along the way, she would have never made it. White people had to put their candles in the window and say, this is a safe place to come. So it's okay to be white, and it's okay to acknowledge your past, but there's always white people in the struggles sitting right beside us. And that's what's most important, I think. And you're sitting right here. You're the same person that put the candle in the window. We're 12% of the population. We cannot do this. As Black people, we're literally 12% of the U.S. population. We cannot do this without white people. So thank you. And it's okay.
I was told one day by a member of the panel, he said, Jeremy, get over your white guilt and live your life and do it well. So here's a good question. What is your earliest memory of becoming aware of racism? When were you first aware of racism?
Before you answer, I'd just like to remind all the panel members, I know most of you, all you are wearing your masks, so just make sure you get that microphone as close as you can so the folks who are watching can hear that. Okay.
We'll start anywhere. Jimmy, you want to start this question off? What's your earliest memory of racism, encountering racism?
My grandfather, my favorite grandfather, who told me, he encouraged me quite, but he died when I was 11. He used to barbecue every Saturday. And of course, we lived in the country. I lived in the country with them when I went to visit. And we barbecued downtown, either behind the beer joint or somewhere else. And the white people owned these places. And I had an aunt who died last July. And we went to clean up and prepare for my grandfather to come. She and I was about, I'm going to say maybe 9, because he died when I was 11. And this little white guy named Rudy Iverson, I don't know what kind of name that is, but he came after, it was his dad's barbecue place, barbecue pit. And my aunt and I were cleaning up. This little boy came up to me, looked at me, and touched my hair, my head, my hair, and he said some derogatory things toward me. And I wanted to beat him up, and my aunt wouldn't let me. She said, they called me Bubba. Bubba, you know you can't do that, because Papa has to barbecue you. And I want to tell you something that we accuse white folk of thinking that black folk all look alike. I didn't know anybody. I didn't know this Rudy Iverson guy. And I could not identify him on the street. But he was a little kid. And my uncles knew him, but I didn't. And so I've never said, you know, white folk are stupid because they think we all look alike. Because when I was a kid, they all looked alike to me. Except the two, it was 5 of them, we stayed on the farm. And it was 3 girls and one owner, and his sister had 2 boys. I knew those 5 people. I saw them, I knew what they looked like. I could not tell other white folks from anybody. So I understand people saying that, but that was my first example of racism. I was devastated that I couldn't beat that little boy up.
Pastor Flakes, this is on Facebook Live right now. So Rudy, if you're listening, come on down to Seguin, Texas. I think I'm going from the oldest. Let's go to the youngest next. Rashad, when did you first experience racism?
I think the first time I experienced racism was around 5th or 6th grade in my English class. I used to be like a really overweight nerd who just loved reading books and taking AR tests. But when I got to this class, I was only able to read off of the bottom 2 shelves. I didn't get to read off the top, and I was always the number 2 best reader. I was never the number 1. And one day I just got tired of it, and I told my grandmother. And so then she sat me down, and I know my mother, she sat me down and she explained racism to me. But I think all I heard was racism, and that's why. And so when I went to school, I was like, that's racist. And I just kept running with that. And so with all my friends, I'd be like, that's racist. So then eventually my principal sat me down, my grandmother sat me down and talked about it. And I think she was fired. And eventually I got to read off the top shows. But that was my first experience with racism.
Dr. Buchanan.
I think mine was probably just microaggressions, being, brown and little kids not understanding. So it's like, your skin's brown like dirt. I was like, no, what? Like, I never thought of it like a negative thing. My mom's an activist, so it's like, I'm always very proud of boys and things like, well, why is your palm of your hand white, but then your skin's brown? Like those types of microaggressions are probably the little things that would make me, that I would say, straight up racism? Ugh, I don't know. I can't even think of any, but it's a lot of microaggressions for sure.
Pastor Megan.
When I was a kid, when I was 7 years old, we started taking foster babies, and we did that for a period of about 10 years, and we had white babies and African American babies and babies of multi-racial and ethnic backgrounds. But my very first memory of being aware that racism was a thing was when we would be in the grocery store or even with family or friends and would get comments or stares or assumptions. And I had I was just a little kid. I had no clue of the complex, racism that was built into the foster care system and the complexities of a white family taking care of a baby of color. And I just knew, and I could understand that people were responding to us differently. Were responding to the babies that we were taking care of differently because of the color of their skin. And I think that was my first real time of being exposed to exposed to racism and understanding that there was something going on.
So I interpreted that two ways. One, my first experiencing racism unconsciously. The second, I was born. The community my family was raised in. If you're familiar with the term redlining, we were being raised in a community that had been redlined. We had food deserts. So unconsciously, I didn't know that. Growing up, being put into a classroom in kindergarten, where English is the only language spoken, and I'm a Spanish-only speaking child. And all the feelings that came with being reminded that the language I was speaking was no longer welcome. Unconsciously, going to the cafeteria, having my tacos in foil paper, and teachers and adults making comments that I ought to have American food. My first encounter with race would be different, like when I'm becoming conscious and aware. So the two are different because race is a social construct. Racism is a systemic approach of it. So my first encounter with race was in third grade when I had a fight. Unlike Pastor, I did fight, but it was with two black twin boys. And I remember that fight. I got beat up, and I remember that I was asked, "What did they look like? What color were they?" And that's my first distinct memory of race being color. Because although I was in a neighborhood that was primarily brown, Latinx, Chicanx, and we had black and brown together, it was the question repeatedly of what color were they, and me then saying they're black, and then being able to pay attention more like to Sesame Street, that there's different colored characters and what that meant. Watching Star Wars and not seeing any people of color on that. So that first encounter with race jolted this level of consciousness for me to later be able to understand my first encounter with racism.
Very good. These questions have been prepared, I should have mentioned earlier, by the library staff and Darren, and given to me to ask. And every once in a while I might throw in one of my own, but Darren's been monitoring Facebook and might have a question or two, and then I think we might ask for a question from the crowd here.
And we are monitoring Facebook, and I want to let those people know who are watching via Facebook Live that if you have questions, just put in the comment section. We have someone monitoring that, and we'll get that up here. So for the audience, for big responsibilities, we wanted to make sure that we could hear everyone. But there is something that we need to point out. We sort of use this book by Ijeoma Oluo, So You Want to Talk About Race, as sort of a gateway for our community to begin to have this conversation. The conversation is not about this book, but her book is an important part of getting us to begin to have this dialogue. So there are two things I want to point out. Well, really it's three. One is the definition that she likes to use for racism in her book. And that is, racism is a prejudice against someone based on race. And those prejudices are reinforced by systems of power. So it's not just the Archie Bunkers of the world. It takes more than just an individual who has some preconceived notion. The other thing I want to point out is, so oftentimes we struggle with, are we really talking about race when we talk about some of these issues? And that certainly has come up a lot with our discussion about police and African American men in particular. So I just want to point this out. She says, it is about race if a person of color thinks it's about race. And two, it is about race if it disproportionately or differently affects people of color. And it is about race if it fits into a broader pattern of events that disproportionately or differently affect people of color. So, Jeremy, if you want to open up to the rest of the room, if people have questions, otherwise we'll continue on.
I think before we open it up to all of you, what does the panel think about about race if a person of color thinks it is about race. It is about race if it disproportionately or differently affects people of color. It is about race if it fits into a broader pattern of events that disproportionately or differently affect people of color. Do you agree with that? When is it about race?
I agree with those things. Don't want to really get into politics, but we are probably going to confirm a judge, Supreme Court judge, who ruled that it wasn't a racial situation when a black man was called the N-word by his supervisor, and that it didn't create a hostile situation. I think if she had read this book, she wouldn't have made that decision.
Very good. Bernadette, I see you shaking your head down there.
Yeah, I would have to, I'd have to agree. It's interesting after Darren, you just read those definitions about racism and systems that keep those underlying things in play. It makes me actually think about my first real racist experience was actually when I had my first child, right? So I'm 29 years old. I'm in the hospital, and they're treating me like meh, you know, and they're asking me like to fill out all the paperwork. It's like, we sent it in already. I'm like, oh yeah. And it's like, the treatment was horrible until they got to the question that they have to answer these questions first. They're like, highest level of education, right? And so my husband's like, I don't know, what's a master's degree? 16, 18? What grade is that? 18th grade? And she's like, oh, instantly our treatment changed. Somehow the person who does the being in the back of the epidural, finally that guy's available, you know, like, it's just so strange. And then all of a sudden, the nurse wanted to know what my mom did. It's like, well, my mom's been an educator forever. She has 2 master's degrees. Like, what grade is that, lady? Like, so when I think about systems, and then every appointment, well, baby appointments, they always sent me to the hospital for, if you had a medical recon, and I would show up and they're like, you're in the wrong place. And it's like, well, why do you guys keep sending me here? And they just kept doing it. I didn't get it until after, you know, and it's like, we would joke, like, maybe I just need to put my medical ID card right here for my job, and maybe they'll treat me differently. It was just the strangest thing, but I could actually say having a baby and being in the hospital was the first real racist experience. And those systems just kept pushing me, kept putting me in this hospital that didn't belong. It was crazy. It was absolutely crazy. So I don't know if that answered your question.
No, you did. That's good. That's good. Rashad, what about you? Here's the statement. It is about race if a person of color thinks it's about race. Do you agree?
Yes, I think both definitions are accurate. So yeah, I agree.
Good. That's good.
Yeah, so agreed as well. And I think it's important because there's other books like the Racial Healing Handbook. There's another book called Courageous Conversations About Race. There are protocols to learn how to engage in this kind of a conversation. And so some of the protocols require us to understand and be clear that race is a social construct. Racism is systemic. And then racist, which is the trigger word of all trigger words, can take us down really, really destructive paths. And the reason why I love that you all set up the protocol the way you did to begin this conversation. I mention that because the common language is needed to engage in a healthy dialogue where we listen to each other from zero, which is what you're describing. Can I empty my mind and my heart enough right now to try to hear another perspective that I may not feel comfortable with? And in Courageous Conversations, we have agreements, and the agreements are speak your truth, which I heard y'all say, right? And that, by the way, derives from critical race theory, the counter-narrative tenet. The second one is stay engaged, that we stay engaged in this conversation even when we don't want to, that we experience discomfort is absolutely necessary, and that includes people of color being uncomfortable. And the final one is accepting and expecting non-closure. And all of this comes with a compass, which I'll just highlight 2 sections. That yes, it is about race when a person of color says it's about race, because that's the believing quadrant. It's what we believe to be true with all of our racialized experiences. The term we use in Fort Worth is, how have you been raced? So how have you experienced this social construct in your life? Another quadrant is the thinking, where if you haven't personally experienced high levels of racism or know exactly what that feels like, you go to the thinking quadrant. That's interesting. I wonder what that means for me. How did that happen? I wonder why they feel that way. And then I will tell you a third one. It's the most powerful one for people of color who have experienced it. It's the feeling quadrant. That as I speak to you right now, my heart is pounding through this microphone because I'm reliving a lot of these memories and experiences as one brown person in America of everything that I have experienced. And I no longer have to justify by saying, well, maybe it wasn't race. No, it absolutely was about race. When I was pulled over, when I worked as 21 years as a juvenile probation officer, 12 years as a gang interventionist in the streets of Fort Worth, and now as a school board trustee in Fort Worth ISD. I don't lie to myself and I don't internalize that, because that is dangerous work to internalize into a human being. So you see the 4 that are coming up: speak your truth, stay engaged, experience discomfort, and then expect and accept non-closure. That's a tough one. But I completely agree with what she did and how she did it, especially with knowing that racism is systemic. She was able to clearly identify that in the book.
Pastor Megan, when is it about race?
As someone who has been in conversation with, especially white folks, who will say things like, well, I don't really think that was about race. And if you have not, I mean, I know we've already talked about this, but if you have not read this or picked it up, I highly recommend it. But on page 22, she says, when a person of color comes to you as a white person and says, this is different for me because I'm not white, when you run the situation through your own lived experience, it often won't compute. This is usually where the desire to dismiss claims of racial oppression come from. It just doesn't make sense to you, so it cannot be right. And I think that we all interpret the world through our own lived experiences. And as white folks, by her very definition of racism, when it is prejudice accompanied by power, we, by that definition, do not experience racism directed at us. And so we do not have a lived experience of it. And so it can be so easy when people of color say this is a racial thing, to dismiss that because we don't have the lived experience. And that's why I think her points about when is it about race, it's about race if a person of color says it's about race. And I think as white folks, it's our responsibility to trust that and to understand that our lived experience is different, and to hear the stories and absorb them and allow those stories to move us to act.
I'd like to add to that too, because I do a lot of social violence work, and we talk about being trauma informed, and the first thing is believe the victim, believe the person in front of you, and then get them to the right resources. I find there's a parallel when we're talking about when a racist acts happen or somebody's reporting racism, it's believe them and get them to the right resources. I think we can go so much further with this conversation if you just believe the person in front of you. And if your background isn't on race work and critical race theory or understanding the power narrative, like, then you need to get them in front of somebody who does know that work. But don't dismiss it. Just say, I'm here to help. I'm here to get you in the right spot. That's it. That's it. It's just so simple. But we instantly want to deconstruct, like with sexual violence, what were you wearing? How much were you drinking? And it's like, come on. Like, your job is just to believe and get them to the right resources. Great point. Great point.
I was listening to something last night. Father Richard Rohr said something to this effect. He said, usually what we hate about someone else is what we don't know about ourselves or about the circumstance. And so I think our position should be, please help me understand. I was completing a unit of clinical pastoral education, and there was a group of 8, and we were engaged in an interpersonal dialogue with one another. And another member of the group, who was black, female, a Baptist, her own denomination would not ordain her, and she wanted to be a minister. There were just several layers of, as the book talked about, intersectionality. I experienced it in that moment. And she said to me, across the circle, she said, "You are a white, entitled male, and you don't even know it." And I was immediately convinced in that moment that she was the authority on this subject, not me. She was the one that sat in a position to inform me about something that I was not fully aware. I thought I was enlightened and loved everybody. And she began to explain to me how privileged I was. And I had no other choice but understand her. There's 4 quadrants, things we know about ourselves that everybody else knows. And we know it and they know it. And then there's the quadrant where there's those things we know about ourselves that nobody else knows. Then there's the quadrant, and I think this is what we're talking about, that quadrant where we don't know it. I don't know it about myself. But nearly everybody else in my life understands that that is true about me. 4th quadrant, I don't know what to do with. That's where I don't know it and you don't know it. We're figuring it out together. You're bound to have a question. Somebody has a question for this panel. It could be about the book or anything that's been said.
Jeremy, while folks are getting the courage to come forward, I'd just like to sort of follow up on something on this discussion about, is it about race? I think there are a lot of well-intentioned people, good people, white people who can't wrap their minds around so many of these issues are about race. And so that's why you hear things being said like, well, there they go, playing race card again. As if we're imagining all of this. So my question is about empathy. And the empathy gap that is built into, sort of baked into the system as well, and how that makes it that much harder for us to have these conversations, for us to begin to tear some of those things down. How do we begin to address that? We see it in institutions, schools, hospitals. We see it in churches. We see it in a number of places. So how do we begin to address that? So at least we're open to at least experiencing some or acknowledging someone else's experience as valid.
Okay, here's a social studies teacher. It's hard to do that in America with our education system the way that it's set up, because if you think about Columbus Day that just passed, we are praising a guy who came in, saw these people who were so kind to him. He immediately started chopping their hands, putting dogs on these people, and sexual assault is occurring, genocide starts to occur, and it's like, then nowhere in her lesson, maybe you all were lucky enough to have a teacher who did teach us about the Tianos that he came in contact with, but our society praises the harshest of people, and it starts in kindergarten. And then think about Andrew Jackson, and he's on a $20 bill, and that guy was awful. Awful. And we praise that guy. So it's like, I don't know how easy empathy can be taught if even in our school system we're praising murderers and rapists. And then I'm surprised that we have this guy employ logs right now. Like, how are we surprised about that? It just makes sense. You know, I don't, so, first I guess we have to open our minds to being okay with saying what my teacher taught me was wrong. And unlearning might be a great way to start. Being with people saying, okay, I'm not going to praise the victor, because who did that person have to step on to get to where they are? Maybe we should praise all the little people that help them get to where they are. You know? Empathy is learned, you know, we have to, because one of the ways we learn is to wait for each other and for each other, and we have to teach them that. So maybe we just have to unlearn first.
Very good. Cynthia, you had a comment. Oh, I'm sorry, Derek. Go ahead. Cynthia.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Buchanan, you get me fired up now. First I'll say I've been known for going around the country saying that race isn't rocket science. It's harder than rocket science. And the reason we say that is at least you can learn about rocket science in school. In K through 12 school systems, we're not taught, when I say the social construct of race, we're not taught that two white guys in Eastern Europe came up with this concept with science in the 1700s. You can Google it. Google the origin of Caucasian. And those two names will come up, Johann Blumenbach and Christoph Miners. If we're having a conversation about race, and I'm a person of color, and my heart is pounding, I'm coming from the feelings quadrant. And empathy is on the action quadrant. I can't get to action until I know what I think, what I believe, and what I feel. Then I can go to action with you. But as a person of color, if you're a person who's in the thinking, I've got to lean into your thinking quadrant versus being offended. So I have plenty of white friends who said, hey, help me understand. And she says it in her book. It's not up to people of color to do this work and take a pause and educate you if you're not familiar with it. There's plenty of material out here now. There's White Fragility by Dr. Robin DiAngelo. There's a lot of work about this. So the exhaustion that comes with doing this work has to begin, actually, the exhaustion actually gets eased up when we speak the same language. And so if you know that those two guys came up with this by using human skulls and said black people are inferior and lighter skinned people are superior, that is the exact same system that came over the seas to the United States when it was being formed. And the reason why in the book it's clear to understand, and young people have access to technology that's teaching them this. So they're frustrated with us, the adults, who don't speak the language that they do. Because you can also look up a YouTube video. It's called The Surprisingly Racist History of Caucasian. So when I say race isn't rocket science, it's harder than rocket science. I'm also saying that it requires a paradigm shift. Much like when people used to think that the world was flat. Can you imagine walking around saying the world is round? What is wrong with this? Crazy person is what they would say. And we're walking around as people of color saying, this thing race is real. I feel it every day. I experience it. I see the patterns. I look at the data, and now we're going to say it's not real data? Now we're going to say that people being impacted by these systems isn't real? How beneficial it is to certain people when things count and don't count. And so I leave that also to tell you that you notice I didn't identify racially when the question was asked. Because I know that if I answer that to say Hispanic, I am clear that the term Hispanic came in the 1980 census. And what that word is rooted in, it's rooted in power. And also to disassociate people from power. So you didn't hear me say Hispanic. You saw me go straight to ethnicity and stay there. Because if I succumb to race, it means that I succumb to this faulty construct by two white guys with 1700 in the years 1700, 80s and 90s, who thought that was cool to say that white people and light skin are more important and more intelligent and have more capacity. So you look at our school systems and you see this achievement gap. You see this opportunity gap. I'm pleading with people to say, what's your belief gap? Do you even believe that kids of color have capacity? And if we don't, then we're just sustaining the same system that was already put in play.
Very good. Panel, anybody else want to comment?
Since we brought up intersectionality, I think it's going to take more than just, school systems or other institutions that we have established. I think that I come from the perspective of the Christian church, and I think that we have a role as Christians in community with one another to be involved in this conversation, this work. And I think about, because, for me it always comes back to Jesus, so I'm going to get Jesus-y on you for just a second, and then I'll pull it back. But Jesus has this encounter with a Canaanite woman, which is in and of itself an archaic term that is used in the Bible itself to describe this woman. She's with a different religious, cultural, ethnic background than Jesus, and she's asking for healing for her daughter. And Jesus not only refuses that healing, but he insults her in the process and says, I am not going to take what is meant for the children of Israel and throw it to the dogs. And she refuses that answer. She just comes right back at him and argues with him and says, even the crumbs that fall from the table, that the dogs even get the crumbs that fall from the table. And so he ends up healing her daughter. And in that process, I think there is an example of unlearning, an example of wrestling with implicit biases. And if that is the Savior that we follow, who's willing to be changed by this encounter with this woman, then certainly that is what we are called to as people of faith, is to do this same work and to be involved in, as you said, Darren, to bridge this empathy gap. And I think that it is our calling, it is our responsibility, and we are not free until all are free. And so I think that all of us in all of our different capacities have the ability to come at this from different angles.
Jeremy, and Sean, I want you to answer the question, but I also want you to answer this, and you can do it in whatever order you want, and answer however you want. You represent a new movement in this struggle. It's a big part of the reason you're on this panel, and the young voices that have come forward, and in some ways been demonized as part of the Black Lives Matter movement. But I think you offer a perspective that people in my generation and the rest of this panel probably don't have. Is there something that you've seen in our conversations, in these talks, in any of these answers, in your experience, that we haven't done right? This younger group is figuring out a way or found a new way to begin to address this.
And don't be worried about being polite.
Yeah, don't be polite.
Too polite.
I think it's just the fact that since this is kind of like such a difficult thing to talk about, I think if there would have been a better way of showing humanity or having that conversation, that it's okay to be on this side or on that side and to acknowledge what's going on and the gap. I think I'm still trying to be polite. But I guess if I answered the question before, it may kind of help. Sure. So when you had asked about the empathy, the gap of empathy, I had wrote down to first, for both sides, to set their intentions. To what is it that you're feeling? What is it that you want to get out? What is it that you bring your perspective? And then that it's okay to be wrong. It's okay to say, I don't think that's racist, or that is racist, or I feel this way, and that's fine. But to also be open to hear the other person, and to pick others up. I know a lot. I've been having a lot of meetings and discussions with people, and whenever I have someone like Chief Nichols, whenever we would talk, he would say, okay, well, this is a race conversation, so I'm just gonna pull myself out. And I tell him, I think the first few times I wouldn't say that, but after a while I was like, no, that's defeating all of this if you just pull yourself out. I was telling them that it's important that if both of us are in this talking together about race, then maybe we can figure out something. Because if me being black, I'm saying everything is racist, and him being white is saying, no, nothing's racist, we're not getting anywhere. So both of us can actually sit together and say not only our sides, but talk about it, that we can move somewhere. And so what I was getting at is if maybe there was an environment where both sides can talk, or we were given the space to be wrong, to say some things wrong, to learn, and to not have it held against us. I know even I've said some things that are wrong. I'm still going to say some things that are wrong, but I think I've built enough people around me to be able to pull me to the side, tell me how they feel that I was wrong, and so I can say, okay, well, let's go talk about it, because I didn't mean that. And it may also be because we live in kind of I think they call it like a cancel culture thing. It's like as soon as you say one thing wrong, you're done. You know, whether you're a business owner, whether you're a student in school, you're done. And so maybe that's another thing. If we build some kind of environment where you can be wrong, it's okay to be wrong, but you also need to be open to talk about it, then that would close that gap and move us forward as a whole.
I think it's a week after George Floyd's death, the Baptist Ministers Union invited the local police officers to their churches to come and speak. The chief went, Rusty went, Mike, several of them went. And I was telling my dad about it, and Daddy's 83 years old and grew up in sort of central West Texas, and I was telling him all about it, and I said, but I can't go. I'm too busy. I got all this going on at church, and I can't go. And he said, it was on the phone. He said, well, Jeremy, he said, I think you ought to go. I think it's that important, and if you go, I will go with you. And I started to, I became tearful that my 83-year-old daddy knew how important this was. Is he always able to talk about this? The issue of race, no. But there's a deep empathy, and he tries. Most of us growing up in the 70s and 80s, I learned most about civil rights and race from George Jefferson, Fred Sanford, and those guys, right? And there was a white cop on Sanford and Son. You remember? Howie. He got it wrong every time, but he desperately wanted to be in a relationship, and that made it okay. So we're gonna get it wrong. We're gonna get it wrong. Someone has a question. Yes.
So when we posted about this event on the library Instagram account, we had some comments. And one of the comments was, so I'm going to ask you guys what your thoughts are on this comment. They said that they quoted Morgan Freeman. The best way to get rid of racism is to not talk about it. So I want to know what your thoughts are on this comment that we have.
You just start wherever you want to. And I will keep my mouth shut.
I'm just wondering what's the rest of the sentence like? Not like the best way to get rid of it, not talk about it and do action. Like what? You don't even have some context. That doesn't sound very moving for your life. He's the voice of God. I mean, like, what is he talking like that? So I just want to know about that first of all. But I understand though what the person was trying to say, and that is if we just start talking about it, maybe it'll go away. Kind of like that bill we all have. Maybe it'll go away. But no, it's like, you gotta pay the bill, otherwise we get that credit. And so, the reality is, nothing uncomfortable goes away until you lean into it. And just like the math problem, that's really, really hard, but once you do it a couple of times, you understand the order of operations, and you get it, it makes it easier. So, sadly, they're wrong, and Morgan Freeman was wrong in that quote. But I think you just have to engage, as uncomfortable as it makes you. You have to engage.
There are times when you don't want to talk to people who are racist and have a lack of understanding, think that they are right, think they got it all together, who have talk about reverse situations, like reverse discrimination. They talk about, well, what about this black-on-black crime? As if that's settles something, or puts you at a disadvantage. You have to talk about situations to address them, correct them, to deal with them. If you don't talk about them, there's a Liberty commercial, Liberty insurance commercial, and this man is talking, and his best friend has his head in the dirt. I like commercials. His best friend is ostrich. And so he said, well, did you get that? Well, no, we didn't get it because he had his head in the dirt. And if you have your head buried in the sand, in the dirt, how are you going to solve the problem? Not talking about the problem doesn't solve it. It just lets it lie. And that's what it is, a lie. You have to talk about it. And you can ask that person if they'd like to, they can talk to me. I'll explain.
Tell them to bring a Ruby with them.
So, I was just going to say, Reverend Flakes, you're speaking to what the book talked about with Ijeoma, that she mentioned, it's like when she was in an abusive relationship, and the constant beating up of her mentally or physically takes a toll over time. She mentioned it's as if we're walking in the street and you're randomly getting punched. Those bruises are real. And so I think about people that have that train of thought. I can understand, because the book, I think, does an excellent job of describing why it is that discomfort pushes them away from the conversation. She said guilt, shame, and I can't remember, there was a third one, anger. And so I think about, we can't address an illness and a disease without knowing the root causes of it. She mentioned that as well. Race is so pervasive and it's so ingrained in our society, and she mentioned it time and time again in the book, and she gave plenty of examples how educational system, criminal justice system, XYZ, right? Would I go to the doctor for having a brain tumor and want a doctor that focuses on lung cancer? No, I want the doctor that can zero in on the type of illness that I have. So race not being addressed is similar to abuse not being spoken of, similar to all of the other examples that she gave. And I definitely don't think that's the way it is. But I also believe that learning a race, the example we used in my world, it's like flexing a muscle. Maybe my muscle on race is very weak. I don't know how to engage in a conversation. I don't know how to bring about solutions. But the more I read, the more I listen to people like on this panel, the stronger my muscle is getting on race. The more mistakes that I make, as you said wonderfully, on how to have the courageous conversations, the stronger my muscle will get. And I just think that at the end of the day, you get to this point of like what W.E.B. Du Bois talked about, the talented 10th, talked about there's unconscious people, there's conscious people, but unfortunately, with this topic, only 10% of society tends to be conscious. Remember, that's by design, to not teach about this subject. and to make it taboo. And so people that do that actually belong to the 90%. W.E.B. Du Bois said, the talented 10th, you are the 10% that are conscious, and you are responsible for waking up the other 90%. That's the action quadrant. So, all in all, if you don't want to talk about it, then maybe that muscle's pretty weak. But there's plenty of other people in our communities whose muscles are pretty strong. And when I listen to Reverend Flex here, as I'm listening to him tell his story, and I got to visit with him prior, I hadn't met him before. He did one of the most powerful things, and I think it's what he's doing now. One of the most powerful counters to race, the conversations of race, is storytelling. And when people of color tell their story, it can tap into the feeling quadrant. And by the way, the reason that quadrant to me is the most important one, the feeling quadrant is the transformation zone. And we want to talk about faith and all that. Exactly. The reason that when I could repent and when I could engage in that conversation, I was in my feelings when that happened to me. So we can get people into the feeling quadrant by listening to these stories. It transforms people.
I too would like to hear more context in that. But not to make fun of the person, but just to say, like, if there's a leak in your roof, you don't just turn away and then look back at it and the leak is gone. Or if, since racism is such a difficult thing, if your restroom is clogged, you don't just turn around and then it's gone. It's unfortunate that it's, not a comfortable situation, but someone has to do it. It has to be done eventually. But yeah, that's how I feel about it. But I wanted to ask you, you had said, what was it that you said about the 10% and 90%? I'm sorry.
Yeah, W.E.B. Du Bois said that the talented 10th are the 10% that are conscious and aware. They call that woke work, right? And the 90% of the people that we say are asleep, they're unconscious. Now, there is a percentage now that's been added since his research that talks about Dr. King. She spoke about disconscious people. Disconsciousness are people those are probably the most dangerous because they think they know what they don't know. Those are people that are faking it to make it. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it just made me think about there's this kind of business theory or method or whatever, but it's like the 80-20 rule. So it's like 20% does 80% of the finance and then vice versa. So it made me think of that. Yeah, that was it.
Pastor Megan.
I have been learning a lot recently from the Reverend Lewis, and she speaks about how in families, oftentimes when there is abuse or trauma that happens, the family system works very hard to cover it up and keep it quiet because it will disrupt. It won't just disrupt whoever was involved, it will disrupt the entire family system if that is revealed. And she talks a lot about America being that dysfunctional family system, that we have a family secret, and we have put all of these systems into place so that we don't talk about it, we don't address it, we don't deal with it, to try to make ourselves feel like everything is okay. But the longer that family secret is not dealt with, the more that it is going to fester, and the more painful that it is going to become. And the only way to true healing is to reveal that family secret and deal with it, and deal with the ramifications of it. And so I think the only way forward is to have these conversations. And I know, especially for white folks, it is very, that's my perspective, it's very anxiety-inducing because we don't want to say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing or get it, be embarrassed or ashamed. But it is my sincere hope that a year from now I look back at this panel and what I said and think, ooh, I could have done better on that point, and I wish I had known more about this, because that means that I've grown and I've continued to push forward in this. And so I think we all are where we are. We have to start where we are. But we can't let ourselves stay there, or this family secret is going to tear us apart.
Pastor Flex.
Many years ago, I went to work at a city. I'm going to leave the city silent for the moment. And my responsibility was to write the affirmative action plan for this city. And if we had not talked about racism, we would not have had African American department heads. If we had not talked about systemic racism in the systems, we would not have had female department heads and assistant city managers. If we had not talked about it, that city would still be in the dark. That city didn't even want community action in their community because they were satisfied being, it was an educated community, but they were satisfied being white, racist, non-inclusive community. And let's give the poor folk a little help, and that's it. But we actually talked about it. It took 2 years to get the affirmative action plan approved. But we actually did it. Now the lawyers didn't want to talk about the racism that existed because they told me whenever you put it down in writing, that's what they come and sue you on. Yeah, they did. And I said, well, let's put it in writing and correct the system that's been going on. And again, you have to talk about it. If you don't talk about it, how are you going to address it?
Yeah, I mean, golly, that'd be like telling a married couple that was having trouble, just don't talk to each other anymore. You know, I mean, that's just, don't talk about your problem. Yeah, that's kind of avoidance. Yeah, we could.
Jeremy, I know we're late on time. I would just like to take a little bit of privilege here and ask this question, and feel free to ask one more, or as we sort of start to wind down. But I'm very interested in what the pathway forward is for our community, for this country, for this world. And so I'm eager to hear the panel discuss how we began to go from talk in meetings like this, and discussions and books, to actually having policy and action and real change, and changes in the systems that we've seen, so we don't have communities that are left behind, so we don't have achievement and opportunity, so we don't have all of the other barriers that have been put into place and have been tied to racism for so long.
Yeah, absolutely. What's next?
What would you like to see?
Okay. So this is where I get to say that I'm not bragging, it's a testimony. In Fort Worth Independent School District, we're the first ones to pass a racial and ethnic equity policy in 2017, but we actually started a conversation in 2015. And it took that long to prepare the soil, and we did it the way you're doing it now. We did it by engaging the community, our students, our senior citizens, our teachers, our superintendent and board members. And we went on a courageous conversations journey. And then they partook in the designing of that racial equity policy so that it was as comprehensive as we could get it. Who followed suit after us was Grand Prairie and a couple of other districts. Houston has been trying to get theirs done. But the preparation of the soil was the magic of the work. So that by the time that we passed that policy in February of 2017, we were all clear on when we said the social construct of race. There was no debating or arguing the origins of race. We were clear when we said race is pervasive, what that meant for us. What I will say that to me is inspiring, I'm so glad I made the trip today, is to see city leadership, local universities, the faith community. What is well known, and it was mentioned in the presidential debate, is our city at Fort Worth is not at this point. They've avoided it at all costs. And so our school system has moved on, being labeled radical, militants, liberals, all those divisive terms, when all we did was do exactly what we said the educational system was designed to do: to educate, to include, to empower. And so what I'm witnessing here, I think you all have all the makings of a great town that can lead the way, because very few people know how to do this work and are willing to commit to do the work. That policy that we passed also, by the way, included ethics studies. So we're writing our own curriculum. We're almost done. Latinx, Chicanx history, African Africana, to do everything I told you, that we're teaching our children their history from a point of liberation. It also includes the policies of how we hire, how we fire, all of those things included. And here's the one that gets sticky. It also includes the business practices. Because if we're not going to change the financial wealth gap, then we're really just doing social justice stuff. But to really transform communities has to include the dollar amounts. So as I walked into this beautiful facility today, first thing that I'm thinking as a conscious person, who designed it? Who built it? Right? Who furnished it? Who bought the books in? Because if I walked that library, listening to what I walked in earlier, I would anticipate seeing some books of people of color and women and LGBTQ+, and all the isms that we've been talking about would be reflective on those shelves. So, and if they're not, at least the conversation is being had to where many other communities are now being had. So policy and law, that is the way to change systemic systems, is the only way. Because if we don't do that, then everything else is just talk, and it can be done away with when the next city council person comes in, or the next school board person, or the next superintendent. If you do it as a collective community, then you hold each other accountable as a collective community.
Thank you, sir. I agree with you 100%. There are a lot of artificial barriers that people face, governments face. They say stupid things like, and I think I got this out of the book, black folk are always late, they're never on time. Artificial barriers have always stood in the way of progress. And in 1971, this is, I'm dating myself, I am the oldest person on the panel. So I'm almost 80 years old, okay? So in 1971, I had the privilege of sharing with the Human Resource Director at the City of San Antonio. And I asked him to allow me and my staff, which I didn't have at the time, we got staff, to work on the artificial barriers that kept African Americans, Hispanics from being employed in the best positions in the city of San Antonio. And he gave me the opportunity with my staff to work on these artificial barriers. And we did simple things like we studied jobs, and we found out that the police chief secretary didn't have to type 80 words a minute, because all she typed were these little forms. Nobody needed to take 90 words a minute shorthand. Artificial barriers. And in the predominantly white schools, they had this superior education. I'm saying that because I think that's what existed. And in the Hispanic, African American schools, they didn't have this kind of training. And so I got the human resource directors just let me and my staff develop test results that said pass and fail. We didn't say 80%, 90%, because it didn't take all of that. And we changed, not only did we change those entry-level positions, like secretary and clerk and all of that, they were all white. But we also were able to change the standards, the entry-level standards for police and fire. And we saw, you know, when I first got to San Antonio, there was one black firefighter. I don't know how many was there when I left, but artificial barriers. But we talked about the stuff. That's the most important thing, is we talked about it. Yeah. And people were willing to let me speak and hear what I said. And when they said, we're not going to do that, I said, okay, that's fine. But you let me speak. And I think that's the most important thing, is to talk about it and respond to it. And if you never, it can change the policies. I used to tell folk all the time, you can't legislate a person's heart. I don't care about his heart. I just care about the actions. And if they do what's written down, and if we write the right stuff, we just look at the results. And we saw plenty of results. And I agree with Brother Jacinto. He's right. You just do what you say you're going to do, write it down, and judge it based on the evidence and the commitment.
Amen. Amen. Dr. Buchanan.
When I think about how to go from talk to action, I think about, I just want to add on to what's already been said, because it's really, really good. But for myself, one, I have to accept that the system that was built was not designed with me in mind. So I have to accept that, and it's like, okay, so I'm not white, Anglo-Saxon male property owner. Higher education wasn't built for me. Property ownership wasn't built for me. But now that I'm here, you know what I mean? So that's kind of the philosophy I take. I said, okay, accept that and stop that it's not for me. But get a seat at the table anyway. And if I can't get a seat at the table, somebody should make me at the table. Get somebody to get a seat at the table, because once you get a seat at the table, you get access. And that access for me that I learned through my experience in higher ed as a student, as an administrator, is you have to look at the data. And you have to let that data determine the direction. Because every institution has goals, right? They have these goals, and they're really lofty, because that's where they want to be something. That's their mission. And you use that data that you collected and say, look at the mission. Are we even reading this? Well, if our data, if we have some people slipping through the cracks, then we're not reading our mission, so we have to let that data drive our direction. And then you can develop policies that get you where you need to go, because policies are I guess the measurements are matrix on how we ensure things are going to go the right way. So I feel like if you can at least accept that this isn't built for you, but still get a seat at the table, that's all the action that you need.
That's good. Pastor Megan.
As someone who is pastoring a church, and I did not write my bio, and I'm grateful for those who did, but they identified my church spirit of joy that I love deeply and passionately, and I'm very proud of as a diverse congregation. And I would say we do have people of color in our congregation, but I would not classify us as diverse. The majority of our congregation members are white, and we also just purchased a property. We are a church that up until this point has not had a building to call our own. And so we purchased the Juan Seguin Elementary School, which is a building and property that was, its original intent was for Mexican students when Seguin was segregated. And so we are moving into a space with whole lot of history, and that has is a particular place of shame for our community for how people were treated, and there are a lot of folks who are very proud of the graduates who came out of that school, and so it's multi-layered and multifaceted, and we're a primarily white congregation. So I have been acutely aware of that reality since we started moving in that direction and purchased that property. I think for us, as a community of faith, our responsibility moving forward is going to be very intentional about these conversations within our own community, and to be very intentional about relationship building outside of our congregation, outside of our own community. So getting to know our neighbors, building connections with other congregations, with other faith communities. And we live in the Bible Belt here. I don't know the percentage of Seguin that is connected to a faith community, but I would guess that it is very high. And I also know that when congregations, when faith communities are able to come together, their ability to do collective action together is very high, because when you get those kind of numbers together, you can see real change. So I think being in the conversation, no matter how hard it gets, building relationships, and then from those relationships working together to institute real change. And I know that as a community of faith, Spirit of Joy, we're going to mess it up. We're going to get it wrong sometimes. We're going to need to repent. We're going to need to take a long, hard look at ourselves. But none of that gets us off the hook from doing the work and moving forward. So I'm excited and anxious and hoping that we are willing and ready to take those risks. And I have several congregation members sitting out here today, so and hopefully more tuning in. So hopefully all of y'all hear me and are ready to go.
Rashad, what do we do?
I think on a day-to-day basis, if we're able to open our minds and empathize, that's a great start. I think I'm sure that since all of us are here, we are able to open our minds and empathize. I think whenever you had talked about that, the 20% that are conscious, that are going to be the ones that change the world, I think we are that 20% that can do that, because we're open to having those discussions and listening. And I think another one is educating, or promoting the education, people to educate themselves, not necessarily telling them what to do or what decision to make or what party to be on or vote for, but instead telling them to go educate themselves to make that decision on their own. I know a lot of times, especially with my generation, a lot of us, we just pick one side, but when you ask us why, we say, I don't know. Even my little brother, I asked him, like, why did you do that? He's like, I don't know. But what you mean you don't know? I said, I don't know. So if we're able to educate or have that talk to her one day, like now he called me yesterday, he was like, you remember what I did, yada, yada, yada? And I said, yeah, you know why you did it now? He said, yeah, I did. I know now. We just give them that environment for someone to be able to think about those things, to realize, educate themselves, come back and discuss with you. I think that's one of the biggest things we can do on a day-to-day basis.
Very good. Darren, what else needs to be done? I have a closing. I have something I want to do that will take that long. It's a closing.
Okay. I would just remind people that copies of the book are still available here. Again, this is sort of a gateway to a larger community discussion. I invite you to participate in any way that you can. And again, thanks to the library and to all the other partners, TOU, Seguin ISD, Reverend ISD, Seguin and the Chamber of Commerce, I failed to mention. They were also involved. Thank you, Kendi. And it's just been so valuable, who have been so supportive. And thank you to everybody in the room and to the panel. Kendi.
So this took real courage. I know it did. And so I want you to affirm them. First, I want you to thank them. Let's thank them. And now, and I hope this isn't awkward for anyone, but where you're sitting and not in random order, individually, I want you to make an I statement. Just say, as you're brave enough to do it, I hear you. And you're saying that to our panel. Just say, I hear you. Donna, you say it first.
I hear you, and I will listen.
I hear you.
I hear you, and I will take action.
I hear you, and I'll take action.
I hear you, and I pledge to be a better ally. I hear you, and I will take action.
I hear you, and I will keep learning.
Now, collectively, let's say it together. We hear you.
We hear you.
We hear you. Thank you. Reverend Flakes, close.
Can I just ask this? In 1963, a song was written and sung, and I'd like for all of you all to, maybe many of you know it, but it's called Blowing in the Wind. Bob Dylan, I think that's the name, Bob Dylan. Look that song up and see whether these questions are relevant. I can read it if you want to hear it.
You go right ahead.
All right. It says, how many roads must a man walk down before you call him a man? How many seas must a white dove sail before she sleeps in the sand? How many times must the cannonballs fly before they're forever banned? The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind. And then it's blowing in the wind. Then it says, how many years can a mountain exist before it's washed to the sea? How many years can people exist before they are allowed to be free? How many times can a man turn his head and pretend that he just doesn't see? The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind. The answer is blowing in the wind. The final one says, how many times must a man look up before he can see the sky? How many ears must one man have before he can hear people cry? How many deaths will it take till he knows that too many people have died? The answer, my friends, blowing in the wind. The answer is blowing in the wind.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.